all publications, even right down to the sort of regional news, will hunt for controversy in their news. They want something that not necessarily will divide people, but that will generate some kind of conversation.
Controversy is a way of momentarily grasping the space and sort of controlling the space, because all eyes are on you if you do something that people feel they just can't ignore.
In the beginning, there was an explosion that filled an impossible void. And then there were planets that defined something from the nothingness. Then came life. First minute, then large and cumbersome, and then man. And man had to learn to survive, to make fire, to find purpose in existence itself. And once all that was sorted out, man learned to get annoyed about stuff. So this is a podcast about some controversies. Not the big political controversies, not corporate espionage or fraud. No, none of that. Controversies you may not even have known happened, or how weird they were. So join Andy Smith on a 5-part miniseries delving into little controversies in different aspects of our media. In this final episode, we look at just what controversy is, what purpose it plays in society, and how the media shapes our conversations. Over the past 4 episodes, we've looked at controversies of various magnitudes across various different medias. We've heard about the upset caused by video game violence and some problematic marketing. We've heard about fan backlash to movie casting, about how difficult topics within children's literature can unsettle and upset parents and others, and about how imagery, as immediate as it is, can offend instantly. In some cases, the outcry was short-lived. In other cases, there was a very real message being spoken, and the controversy forced the issue into the public forum. In other words, then, some of it was deeply meaningful, and some of it was just stupid.
Make a U-turn if
And so to finish this series off, I wanted to get a different perspective from the viewpoints of people who think about society and media in a scholarly way, to learn about what controversy is, what it tells us about ourselves and the societies we live in, and what purpose it serves. And so I spoke to 2 academics, one an expert in sociology and one in journalism, to hear their thoughts. First, I went to Manchester to speak to a fella who knows his stuff about society.
your destination is located on the left.
So I've just pulled up in Manchester, just at the university campus. I'm going to be interviewing Professor Nick Crosley. So let's see if we can find his office without getting lost. Should be a miracle. So this is it. I think we've got to get up to the 3rd floor. Helpful signs. Professor Nick Crosley worked as a lecturer in the sociology and philosophy of psychiatry at the University of Sheffield, going on to become the head of sociology at the University of Manchester, before taking up his current role as the university's sociology rep for the School of Social Sciences BA Economics degree.
Do you think controversy is a way of society policing itself?
Yeah, I suppose it's a way of testing the boundaries. One of sociology's founders, Durkheim, talked about punishment as a way of reinforcing society's norms, because it teaches everybody where the boundaries are, and it reinforces both in the sense of reminding people what it is that they ought to do, and also reminding them what happens if they don't. And I suppose controversy, in some sense, is slightly more open than that, because there's usually several sides to a controversy, and what makes it controversial is the fact that we're not entirely sure whether things are acceptable or not, or at least some people think one thing and some people think the other. But yeah, I mean, I think it does. It is a way in which we remind ourselves of what our values are and what our norms are, and how we think we ought to live our lives.
But of course, our foray through controversies past also had their roots in media. After all, without the media, especially before social media became so prevalent, we would not know about half of these things. We would only be exposed to outcries that literally happened in our neck of the woods, via word of mouth, overheard conversations on the bus, or drunken and belligerent relatives at Christmas. So I wanted to get a handle on the media's role in all this and took myself off to another university. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what the media is in relation to, I suppose, morals in society.
I'm going to answer that in the most annoying way possible. That's a really interesting question, which gives me a couple of seconds to think about it.
Dr. Rhiann Waller has a background in covering both hard news as well as feature writing and is now a lecturer in journalism at the University of Chester.
The media isn't one great big homogenous lump. I think what's quite interesting, say for instance with the internet, you've heard of the bubble effect. So this idea on social media that because, say, Twitter is almost infinitely customizable, you follow people or you don't follow them.
Okay, yeah.
On Facebook, it is mostly your friends and acquaintances. And we tend to be drawn to people who believe or subscribe to very similar values to us, to a certain extent. The internet has kind of created an environment where we are living within these bubbles, where we are kind of fed ideas, which we'll probably agree with. Like if I look at my Facebook feed now, I'm likely to find kind of political memes, news stories that people are either horrified with, but they expect me to be horrified about as well, or things that kind of support our worldview. But there's also these little needles that kind of puncture the bubble, because your friend's friend's friend might comment and say something completely different. Whereas with the media in its kind of older forms, broadcast media tends to be, while not completely objective, it tends to be more objective in the UK. Yeah, and we've got an immense tradition of partisan reporting in the UK. So we still had bubbles then. I mean, what Guardian readers might think of as being controversial, say, for instance, palm oil in the rainforest, responsible consumerism, versus the Daily Mail, who think that, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but for a while they were reporting on what I would consider non-news, things like teachers transitioning transgender T-shirts.
Yeah.
And they would present in school as male before the summer holidays and then present in school as female after the summer holidays. And they were writing articles about this, not front page articles, but front of paper articles, as though it was a controversy. So I think what certain audiences might find controversial from one publication, they might not from the other. But one thing I will say is that all publications, even right down to the sort of regional news that I used to write for, will hunt for controversy in their news. They want something that not necessarily will divide people, but that will generate some kind of conversation. I'd be really, really interested, going back to the idea of social media and new media, to see just what proportion of news stories now, particularly celebrity stories, are generated between celebs or influencers, I hate that word, but heavy social media users who post something and then somebody else takes offence to it, and then it kind of blows up into this big thing. And then you've got news stories about it because it happens to be somebody with some kind of platform who's saying that. So I think it's gone from controversy emerging from what I'd call hard news stories, so maybe a rise in crime, and the controversy is over how you would deal with it, to the point where actual news stories are being generated on the basis of thoughts and discussions before something has even happened. The actual conversation, the actual controversy becomes the news.
As Nick said there, controversy could be a way in which we remind ourselves of what our values are. So that got me wondering about those values and how tricky it is to clarify what they are, sometimes even to ourselves, never mind to others. So no wonder there is a clash from time to time. Like in the imagery episode where I just couldn't get my head around my own contradictory thoughts on what is and isn't art. The example I used was that I like graffiti when I like it, but not when it's a giant ejaculating penis on the side of the supermarket. Moral values are rules, just like laws, but laws can at least be clearly written down. The only way we can try to understand if we're on the same page as everyone else is by flaring up when we don't like something they've done. But I don't know what is morality anyway? Does controversy come from morality? Because it can't come from anywhere else. It can't come from law. So it must come from, you just don't like something I'm portraying.
Yeah, I think I guess it must come from that. I mean, I suppose the other thing to say about controversy is that controversy probably also sometimes enables change, because maybe by going through controversy, we do finally come to accept something that previously we might not have accepted. So controversy might be transitional. And I suppose perhaps related to that, that's because we might not always be quite sure what it is that we are hostile towards when we do feel hostile towards something. So our gut reaction to something maybe is to flare up and try to condemn it. And I suppose in some cases people's position hardens and they just carry on in their opposition. But maybe other people, once the immediate gut reaction has subsided, begin to reflect and think to themselves, well, what is it? Why am I opposed to this? And should I really be opposed to this? Is there any good reason for me to, or should I be accepting of it? So I suppose there's that sense of throwing into question things that previously were unquestioned, always with the possibility that you might decide that that taboo that's been trampled over or whatever was unnecessary anyway in the first place.
Do you think then that's a society's way of shaping its, how to put it, law, black and white, it's on that piece of paper, you know it. Morals, there's no way to gauge your morals versus mine. But we all have some shared morals to a point. We know not to spit in the street.
Yeah.
Well,
some people still do.
Some people still do. But that's some kind of shared moral. Is this the way that we explore that?
Possibly. I wonder how healthy it is, though. I think, say, for instance, opinion pages in newspapers, their fuel is controversy, whether it's generating it or reacting to it. I mean, we had, I say had in past tense because Katie Hopkins has obviously come a cropper recently for making some unsubstantiated statements about Jack Monroe, a blogger. So that's really interesting. She's been done for defamation, basically. And I wonder what that's going to do to her standing, whether she's going to keep her column, because she's already been dropped from one. But she's a really good example of somebody whose career would not exist if it wasn't for controversy. She lives through it. That's her bread and butter, is offending people or marshalling her supporters. So I think in some ways, I think that can be quite destructive. I think if it's one-upmanship, if it's virtue signalling, or if it's an attempt to stir the water for personal profit or just to troll, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Yeah. But I think a constructive dialogue about where we're going as a society can certainly be facilitated through controversy. I think if there's controversy, at least we're talking about the matter at hand. At least there's a dialogue going on somewhere, or a multi-person conversation. I'd be more worried, for instance, if we had politicians who were taking decisions and people weren't paying attention to them and they weren't controversial. I think it's healthy and good to question things as long as it's in a constructive way.
Yeah, and when there is a dialogue, I think there is then a possibility that people, because people are forced to engage with other groups of people who they may never engage with in the course of their everyday lives, I think possibly there is an opportunity for people to gain respect for one another and to come to understand one another's points of view better than they may have done previously. And I think there's potentially something quite positive in that, because it's not a tokenistic acceptance, which I think sometimes liberal culture can encourage, that we feel we have to accept everybody's point of view. But in a sense, we do that in a relatively thoughtless way. We just kind of, yes, because it's the right thing to do, we accept other people's points of view. Whereas in those moments of controversy and conflict, we really quite seriously engage with what it is that they're saying. And we may find, even if we're never ultimately persuaded of their point of view, that nevertheless we gain a certain amount of respect for them and a certain amount of understanding of what it is that they stand for and that they want to do, which is a genuine respect, rather than, like I say, just a tokenistic respect because I respect everybody.
And again, going back to whether controversy is a positive or a negative force in society, it can be very positive if you're exposed to new ideas or you actually really think about them. It can be very negative if all it does is reinforce cognitive bias, if it tells you what you already think you know, But yeah, I think controversy is bound up with a lot of different news values, and I think it's something that the press has made a lot of use of in the past, for good and for ill. But going back to the idea of constructive and destructive controversy, I think constructive is when you kind of find that the two sides actually do have some kind of common ground somewhere, or there is a possibility of compromise. Destructive is when you end up with very opposed groups who are unable to have a dialogue. And I think the media can play a role in that as well, because there are certain forms which invite conversation, and there are certain forms that invite mudslinging. And certainly kind of as a journalist, I wouldn't have two people with opposing views in the same room together. I would be the conduit for them. I'd talk to one and then I'd talk to the other. And there's a huge amount of responsibility involved in that. Even in terms of actually being a journalist, you've got to be aware of possible controversy. You were talking about journalistic ethics before, the IPSO Code of Practice, which used to be PCC. Sometimes, and I probably shouldn't have done this, because obviously sometimes your duties can contradict. They can be mutually exclusive. So your loyalty to your publication can sometimes clash maybe with your duty of care to a certain extent of the people you're interviewing. Because what you think might make a fantastic story, which may well be syndicated because of just an offhand comment somebody's made, but it could land them in a whole heap of mess. Quite often what I ended up doing when I was in the middle of an interview and somebody said something that I thought this could really come back on them, is I would double check it with them. Because as far as they were concerned, they were the living, breathing human, and I did not want to be the agent of their not necessarily sort of John Ronson level life ruining, but certainly them getting into trouble for some reason. And I didn't want to be culpable for that. And quite often they turn around and go, nope, I'm quite happy for that to go in, because they were enraged or because they actually really genuinely believed it, and that was fine. And they knew what they were in for, and I knew what they were in for, and that was okay. But I think I'd kind of developed a practice of listening out for stuff which was controversial and picking up that one sentence or that paragraph. And that's where the story lies.
Yeah, because that's where the conflict lies.
Because that's where the conflict lies, yeah. Absolutely.
But while controversy can shine a light and force us to explore other ideas, it can polarise and leave some out in the cold too.
Yeah, I suppose there is there are a process of polarisation and people group, but I guess people can also feel displaced as well if they find that the people immediately around themselves have a different take on it to themselves. I mean, I suppose a bit like the big example at the moment would be something like Brexit, where people are in some cases, I think, finding themselves very uncomfortable in certain company, because it turns out that people who they knew very well and they liked have a very different view. And this issue, it can't be ignored. It's right there in your face. So yes, I think there's a sense of engendering a sense of belonging and feeling a part, but also often along with that, a sense of distance and perhaps alienation from groups and friendships and relationships that you were previously a part of.
But while contentious issues like Brexit can force divides between people, the press can also bring people together by normalising hitherto outrageous things.
So in some ways, something can be kind of societally controversial, but the media kind of plays a role in making it not controversial as well. So it kind of can work in reverse.
You mean by bringing it to the mainstream?
Bringing it to the mainstream and also softening it a little bit. A good example of that is body modification. And I've seen the difference in articles that run up and down my newsfeed about people dyeing their eyeballs and having really ornate tattoos. And some people would post it and go, yuck, look at this, isn't it disgusting? I don't know what people are doing to themselves. But I've been noticing, and again, this is anecdotal because of the bubble effect, but more and more I'm seeing people going, well, why are you complaining about it? It's not hurting anybody. It's their body. Yeah. It's their autonomy. You might find it visually a bit off-putting, but actually this is just the way people live. And what that means now is that people are exposed to those articles, and they're exposed to the idea of that's not the scary guy with a split tongue and the devil horns on his forehead. That's Barry who drives a bus. Yes. You know? Yeah. He likes reading Tolkien books and he has 2 kids, you know. And I think that's really interesting because we've got a a media, if we're going to go back to the media as a gestalt whole, that thrives on controversy, it sells based on controversy, it will deliberately court controversy sometimes.
Yeah.
But also it takes things which are out of the ordinary, that other people might find controversial, and normalises them at the same time. So it's this big whirling stew of different concepts all going on at the same time. A lot of it's very contradictory.
Naturally, we can't ignore the fact that a good controversy can be great publicity, and marketing departments know it well and enlist it to help shift units.
And of course, there are lots of the more extreme musical worlds where that's the point, to be controversial too. And I mean, in some ways, of course, there's an economic rationale for doing that. You've got to get your head above the parapet if you're going to sell records. And there's an inflationary process where you've got to go one better or one worse, depending on how you look at it, than whoever came before you, in order to because I suppose that's what controversy does as well. Going back to that idea of space, controversy is a way of momentarily grasping the space and sort of controlling the space, because all eyes are on you if you do something that people feel they just can't ignore. And if you've got something to sell, I guess whether it's records or whether it's politics or whatever it is you've got to sell, then controversy can be a pretty good way of achieving the publicity that you want and just commanding the public attention and the public space for a while.
That leads on to another interesting thing, and that's possibly people both in the media and in the world of sales trying to overcook controversy. I used to do the odd book review, or we'd be sent books to review for the newspaper, and some of them would say, controversial new book by. And I'd be thinking, this has just been printed. If it's just been printed and no one's read it yet, how do we know it's controversial? And it's used then as a kind of a sales mechanism. And I can see why, because you've got things like Lady Chatterley's Lover, and you've got things like the Joy of Sex, and genuinely controversial books which have divided people, even down to Harry Potter in the deep south of the US, of people associating it with witchcraft, which I'm sure did the sales absolutely no harm at all. So yeah, I think it can work in its benefit. And of course, you've got certain mediums which court controversy. I mean, punk, for one thing, was all about controversy and counterculturalism. And I think people are kind of fairly wise to when that's false. Because I've noticed because now I've gone into sort of research to do with news, I'll read articles and the headline will say controversial new. And you'll read the actual story and maybe think this isn't all that controversial. And then you'll read the comments. And lay readers who are, they haven't done a degree in journalism, they're not necessarily trained critical thinkers, but they can tell this is a non-story.
Yeah. Okay.
And quite often you'll get this is a non-story underneath articles now. So I think the internet again has opened this out, and I think journalists are going to have to start thinking quite carefully about what controversy is if they're going to report on it, what actually is and what actually isn't. Not necessarily following their readership to the letter, because one man's controversy is another man's obvious. But definitely in terms of content, and definitely in terms of maybe over-egging something. The one thing that keeps popping up for me is The Last Jedi. The sheer amount of content produced by reviewers disagreeing with each other, the Rian Johnson disagreeing with fans. Yeah. But I tell you what, this will make people's career. There will be academics who will be writing about The Last Jedi controversy in 10, 20 years. I promise you. Wow. So in a purely economic sense, controversy has a purpose. It sells copies. It generates clicks online. How often do you, if you see something float down your Facebook page or on Twitter, do you see something that you disagree with and you have to click on it to read it?
More often than you think. But the reason, if I'm honest with myself, I do that is not so much to read it, but to look at the responses to it to try and reassure myself
that you're in the right.
Yeah.
I'm kind of similar to that in that I read it and I look for flaws. It doesn't always go that way. Sometimes I do read it and think, okay, actually a couple of those points might be salient. But yeah, it's kind of a hate reading exercise.
Sometimes you feel with a potentially controversial artwork or piece of music or something like that, that there can be an element of pantomime involved in it. There can be an element of make-believe involved in it. I think an example when I was doing my research on the punks was violence, and one of the things that came up in a few of the sources that I was looking at in interviews with the early protagonists was a sense that a lot of the violence at the very early punk gigs seemed to be mock violence. It was a kind of a pretense at aggression. People were playing at it, and they became worried as punk progressed, because what they had seen as a playful form of aggression started to become real aggression. So there was a kind of, we were making an artistic statement, we were doing something in what we felt to be a controlled way, and then it gets out of control. And I suppose artworks can be a little bit like that, like your CDs. You can look at something which is on the face of it extremely highly offensive, but you know that happens. Maybe maybe I'm wrong about you. But you know that this happens in a slightly make believe world. So I kind of enjoy playing in this make believe world. But when I go back to my own real life, many of the rules and taboos that have been shattered within that make-believe space, I will then go back and adhere to, because I know perfectly well that that's the appropriate way to live my life. And the controversy perhaps sometimes happens when that art, that piece of art, and with its make-believe element, enters into the real world, and people take it at face value and take it very, very literally.
And I think negativity and bad news and personalisation is part of controversy as well. People's behaviour, because people are much more part of the news cycle now rather than just events. We're much more able to comment on what they do and what they say. It's less about, say, for instance, a controversial policy, and more about somebody talking about controversial policy. And people can play up to this. I mean, a good example of this is Jamie Oliver's Healthy Food in Schools initiative years ago. And if I just said to you, do you think school food should be healthier and more nutritious for young learners? Would you say that was a controversial idea?
No, of course not.
No. What made it controversial?
It was, in my mind, the way he went about dispersing the information. And many people felt it was an edict from up on high rather than a suggestion.
Well, anything involving children is highly controversial.
Sure.
In terms of what's good for them and what's not.
If the exact same circumstance had happened about prison food, we wouldn't have had to say... It would have been controversial, but we would have had a very different discussion, I think, in the public sphere. I think there would have been some people going, why are we investing money in food for prisoners? They should be punished. I think there would be some people who would say that. Yeah. So you'd still have a measure of... And then, of course, you'd get some people going, yeah, but prison is about rehabilitation, not about punishment. We need them to be in a good state of health when they leave, because otherwise, it makes the problem last longer. But this is what I mean by personalisation, is the Daily Star article and the women, the mothers who are feeding their kids burgers through the bars of the school gates, which I'm sure was probably some very clever picture opportunity from somewhere. Yeah. That's when it becomes controversial. The idea of feeding kids nutritious food isn't controversial, but the method of the message was. And then when people realise this isn't just children in general, this is my children, and they're taking it out of my hands, they're taking my children's sort of behaviour in their future and what they eat at lunchtime out of my hands, that's when it becomes controversial, when it kind of starts to impact in a personal way. When it hits home.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things we're kind of, again, going back to newspapers feeding on controversy, one of the things I learned as a cub reporter is make it about the people. For instance, if there's a bus crash, it's not with 12 people on it, nobody gets hurt. It's not a bus has crashed and then 12 people are on board. It's 12 people escape harm during a bus crash.
Right.
So again, this is something that the media has done. It personalises everything. So things that either would have been quite distant or quite abstract or possibly quite, I hesitate to use the word common sense, but fairly uncontroversial, become controversial when you bring individuals in. You only need one person to create a controversy. You could have 99% of people agreeing with one thing, but if one person stands up and says, I disagree with that, and is loud enough, then you've created a controversy. If you find that one person and bring them in, which is entirely possible, you've got a disagreement. It doesn't matter if it's representative of people's general opinions in the public. You've got an interesting story.
Really? I mean, the press wouldn't exist without it, no?
I think you could have a form of press which is highly fact-based, and there are some moves towards that. There are websites which are dedicated just to hard facts. Although there is even some controversy over whether that is possible, because obviously when you're reporting, you select your words carefully, and you select who you quote as well. There's some form of selection process anyway. But certainly the press wouldn't be anywhere near what it is now. You wouldn't have opinion columns.
Well, surely it's not possible, because I'm not a geologist. So if you just give me a list of facts about a seismic earthquake, I can't equate that to my life. But if you tell me you better run, I understand it then.
Well, this is the thing. This is what I was saying before about the bringing in the human side of it. There are straight news reports that will say there was a quake that measured 7 on the Richter scale in Los Angeles. Several roads were blocked off. There were 2 casualties who were taken to hospital, no fatalities. And that will be the report. It'll be bare bones.
Right.
Whether that's as engaging as the feature that comes out afterwards of one of these people who maybe suffered some broken bones and was trapped in a lift for 4 hours, and them talking about their emotional journey as a result of that, I think you could definitely say that they're both news, but one of them is going to have more of an impact on us than the other.
Well, to wrap up, I suppose the big overview question, which might be impossible to answer, do you think the existence of controversy says anything about human nature, about society as a whole?
Yes, I mean, I think it does, because I think it does demonstrate, I think, our social nature and possibly our, moral nature in a broad sense, I think, because controversies, and most of the controversies that we have talked about in this interview are controversies over things which really it would be fairly easy to ignore, things which don't have an immediate material impact upon us. No one's directly interfering in our lives.
Sure.
They're just putting things out there, putting things in that sort of common space of ideas that we that we take offence to. And I think the very fact that we can feel some kind of ownership over that, the very fact that we can feel some sort of right to comment upon, criticise, try to change other people's behaviours and perceptions stems from our social nature, from the fact that we are social beings and that we feel ourselves to be implicated in, affected by what other people do.
None of us are an island. We're never entirely removed from society, and society is this constantly shifting discussion around events and ideas and concepts, some of which people agree with and some which people don't agree with, and ideas of how to move forward as well. So I think in a way, if you have humans in your story, you can't avoid controversy.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned very early on with writing news and with writing fiction and reading fiction is that if you don't have a sense of drama, if something hasn't changed by the end of it, then there's absolutely no point putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard.
So that brings us to the end of the episode, and indeed the end of this series. Over the weeks and months I've been putting it together, the thing that I've taken away is simply that so much of controversy, if you step back and take a look, isn't worth getting upset about. Sometimes you may not like the other person's point of view, sometimes you may not like that they're forcing it into the public arena, but they don't like something you do too, so just chill out. Perhaps that's an oversimplification. draw your own conclusions. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. But for now, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you to everyone who's listened. Thank you to everyone who's got in touch. Please continue to do so. And for now, goodbye. Outrage, Outrage, Outrage featured interviews with Professor Nick Crosley and Dr. Rianne Waller. Head on over to Amazon to look at Nick's bibliography, and do check out Network of Sound, Style and Subversion, the punk and post-punk world of Manchester, London, Liverpool and Sheffield. Now, this is the book that Nick referred to a little bit earlier when he was talking about the research he did into the punk scene and the quote-unquote pretend violence and how that escalated. This book really looks at the birth of punk in the UK and its transformation in a relatively short period of time into what it has become. So essential reading for any music fan, or indeed any sociology fan. And get yourself over to Amazon again for Rianne's book, Ethy's Way, which is her first fiction publication, which can be bought there, which is the story of the titular character Ethy and her journey into the other world, where the veil between the living and the not quite dead is at its thinnest. Head on over to doggeddialogueproductions.com for more about this episode and past ones, and look out for us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And consider hitting that subscribe button, leave a review, come and say hi. It would be nice to see you. This episode was written and produced by me, Andy Smith, and for now, goodbye.